Well, good morning, everybody. They say that the number one fear of everyone is public speaking. I'm feeling that a little bit right now. So I'm really grateful that Dean Amos went before me because she's going to make this talk, her presentation is making this talk make a whole lot more sense. I've been learning about the Federal Power Act by learning on the job, and I would love to take a Federal Power Act class with her. I think it'd be really interesting. So as Jamie mentioned, I'm the Associate Stewardship Director with American Whitewater. For those of you who have not heard of American Whitewater, we are a national nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 1954. We have a mission to protect and restore our country's whitewater resources and enhance the public's ability to enjoy them safely. So what that means is that we represent the conservation interests of whitewater enthusiasts. We do that through restoring flows to rivers that have been impacted by hydropower projects and water supply projects. We do that by protecting freely flowing rivers through permanent protections such as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And then we do that through securing access to rivers, both on a site-specific and local level, and then at a broader policy level at the state. American Whitewater is one of the founding organizations of the Hydropower Reform Coalition, and the HRC works to improve the way that hydropower dams are operated. It works to prevent new ill-conceived dams from going in and to remove unwanted, aging, or unsafe dams. So 17% of our nation's rivers are behind dams. They're in reservoirs. And for over 20 years of working through the Hydropower Reform Coalition, we've removed 222 megawatts of hydropower capacity. And a lot of people think of the HRC as like the ones that are going out and taking down the dams. But really where most of the work is happening is in hydropower relicensing and addressing those dams that are not really going anywhere anytime soon. And so compare that 222 number to 16,000 megawatts that we have worked to continue that operation and also improve the way that that's going. So dam removal is a really exciting way to restore rivers. We are in a new era with it, but as I said, most of the work is happening on dams that aren't going anywhere anytime soon, and working within the FERC process to improve and restore the rivers as much as we can. So restoring rivers that have been impacted by hydropower happens somewhere along this continuum. Rivers have a lot of different values, ranging from ecological values to recreational values, aesthetic values, cultural values. And in our work, we aim to restore as many of these values as we possibly can. American Whitewater does focus on recreation, but we found that a lot of times when the boaters are happy, the rest of the river is happy too. And so yes, the surefire way to restore all of the values of the river is on this end of the spectrum, taking the project out. But since we're talking today about balancing energy in the environment and looking at trends in the production and regulation of energy, it's important for us to acknowledge that this is often not on the table. Sometimes it is, and it's nice that it is, but we're usually working more over here or somewhere in between. Usually those dams are providing some sort of public benefit, and so we're not talking about removal just yet. We're doing what we can within the system to move where the river is from here over to the right as much as we possibly can. So we just heard for an hour about FERC, so this will be quick here. As we learned, non-federal hydropower dams are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and it issues licenses to spell out the terms and conditions of the operation of hydropower projects. These licenses, as we learned, last anywhere from 30 to 50 years. And when the first FERC licenses were issued, there really weren't any environmental regulations on the books. And so this allowed hydropower companies to come in and maximize hydropower production and profit at the expense of the other values of the river. Then in 1986, the Electric Power Consumers Protection Act was passed, and that required that non-power values be considered equally to power values, and that the process for building a license or rebuilding a license be opened up to the public. And so now the other values of the river have a seat at the table. And as we learned, this is where dam removal comes into play, but this is also where we can get back into the system here and try to restore some of those values that were lost when the dam was first built. So for us, that's meant putting water back in the rivers. Here's a before shot from the North Fork Feather River down in California. This is just downstream of the Cresta Dam. And the original FERC license, I believe, allowed for a minimum in-stream flow of 100 cubic feet per second. And compared to what the Feather River had once been, that's basically dewatering the system. After the new license was implemented in 2002, this is how things looked. So, you know, if you have an eye for rivers and river restoration, you might note that this still looks a little bleak. This is 300 cubic feet per second now instead of just 100. It is an improvement, and it's a big improvement, actually. And so that's what the FERC relicensing process has allowed us to do. So the story of what's happened on the North Fork Feather River is actually a really good example of what can be achieved through the relicensing process. And it's also a really good example of some of the issues that can come up not only during the relicensing negotiations, but also during implementation. And so I'm going to tell you a story. And that story is about how frogs and boaters became the best of friends in California. So this story originates out of some very deep conflict between two river values. And these river values ultimately are ones that actually never needed to be pitted against one another in the first place. A lot of times recreation and ecological values get placed head to head, and I think this is really unfortunate. And this story here represents how when we work together, even though it sounds, you know, we worked together, but when we work together, we can actually achieve a greater goal. So the North Fork Feather River is located in Northern California in the Sierra Mountains. If you can make out on this map all of those red and green dots, those are actually existing hydropower projects within the state. So as you can see, you know, a lot of the rivers in California are pretty tapped out. The Feather River is known as the Stairway of Power for PG&E down in California. There are four major FERC license projects on that stretch of river. So then we'll zoom in a little bit more down to the river level. The North Fork Feather River starts up in its headwaters, which are dammed, forming Lake Almanor. The river flows down through here, down to Lake Oroville, which is also dammed. And then in between, there are numerous powerhouses. That's what each one of these squares is. The ones where this story happens are three, Rock Creek, the Cresta, and the Po. You can see that the rest of the system is also very heavily tapped out. So the next few slides are going to be hydrographs. And for those of you who have taken hydrology, these will look familiar to you. For those of you who are boaters or fishermen, you'll be familiar with what a hydrograph is. But for those of you who are not, what this is a graphical representation of a flow in the river over a course of time. So on the vertical axis, we have flow in cubic feet per second, or CFS, and then down along the horizontal axis, we have time. So for this representation, this is over the course of a year. You can pan out or zoom in, depending on what you're trying to find there. So before hydropower went into the North Fork Feather River, that's what this blue line represents, reaching peak flows above 10,000 cubic feet per second in the winter and spring storms, and then getting down to base flows of about 1,500 cubic feet per second in the summer. After Lake Almanor went in, the flow regime started to change pretty significantly, and that's what this red line is here. It still tracks the basic trend of peaking and then coming down, but the maximum flows are greatly reduced, almost cut in half. And then after those 3 dams went in, the Rock Creek, Crusta, and Poe dams, that's this yellow line here, again, very different. And I just want to call out the fact that the lowest summer base flows for an unimpaired system are about the same level of the maximum flows in the winter and spring. So this hydrograph and this river system has been completely altered. We're not dealing with what it once was at all. And dam removal is not on the table. So coming back to the blue line, that's not an option. So we're going to do what we can with what we've got. Now these, the data points that created this are from averages, and I believe they're over months. So when we hone in on a data set from one specific year, it gets a little more drastic about the contrast between before and after. So we're going to look directly at the Rock Creek reach in 2002 when the new license was implemented. And this was during a dry year. And so the hydrograph, as you can see, is more or less flatlined. And the new license was implemented in March of 2002, and so you can see that that's what happened right here. So this was the 100 cubic feet per second, and this is the bump up to 300 cubic feet per second. And it took a long time, 6 years of time, to negotiate getting this. The other piece of what we negotiated and what all of the stakeholders negotiated were some manufactured pulse flows. And some of those flows during this part of the season were for channel maintenance, so to move the gravel and the sediment. And then in the summer, we had 4 pulse flows for whitewater recreation. So one other piece of the new license that was negotiated was a provision that allowed for the volume and the number and the timing of these pulsed flows to be modified if biological monitoring showed that they were having a significant adverse biological impact. And so what that required was monitoring. And this is where the implementation comes in and adaptive management comes in. And just because the FERC relicensing process is over, it doesn't mean that we all are done. So in order to study and monitor whether or not there were any biological impacts, the utility spent $10 million studying the impacts of this one very narrow part of the new hydrograph. And so they monitored. And, for the first 4 years, things were doing okay. They monitored fish, and the number of fish were actually increasing. They studied macroinvertebrates to see whether or not the bugs were happy. And those studies were actually inconclusive about whether or not the flows were benefiting or harming them. But then in 2006, something happened. There was a species of frog, it's called the Foothill yellow-legged frog, and egg masses from that species declined sharply in 2006. And there was not really a conclusive link between these pulse flows and that decline, but they got really concerned and they canceled the whitewater flows anyway. So as you can imagine, we were pretty upset. We were upset about this because we had spent 6 years negotiating these terms. The foothill yellow-legged frog had not come up at all during relicensing as a species of concern. And we also felt like it was a little unfair to be focusing on this one part of the hydrograph given this entire picture. But we wanted to do the right thing by the frogs. We don't want to be responsible for trashing the river, right? Like, that's not what we do. That's not what we're about. So we took a step back, and we decided to see if we could figure out whether or not there was something else going on. And we began to work with hydrologists at UC Davis, and they helped us out a lot with this. So, as I mentioned before, that flat-lined image, that was for a dry year. 2006 happened to be a very wet year. And so what these hydrologists did, it was Jeffrey Mount and Sarah Yarnell down at UC Davis, they compared the hydrograph of the North Fork Feather River against a hydrograph from a river that was unimpaired, that was nearby. And so, as you can see, the hydrographs tracked together pretty well. And so just taking a look at this for a second, where do you see the obvious differences? Does anyone want to weigh in? So you might be afraid to say it, but I see the first difference here, the whitewater pulse flows. So I can understand why they would hone in on that. But there was actually one other difference that they discovered that actually turned out to be incredibly important and a very critical time of year for the river. And so that is happening here. You might notice that the red line, the North Fork Feather line, drops drastically, whereas the blue line gradually recedes. So we're going to hone in on that one small piece of the hydrograph a little bit more. So again, North Fork Feather River in red, unimpaired river nearby in blue. Things are tracking pretty well until you get here. This is the last peak flow of the spring, and after that, on this reach, what happened was the hydropower company just shut things down. And so the flows in the river dropped dramatically down to their low base flows. Whereas on the unimpaired reach, what you have is this gradual recession down. This time of year is known as the spring snowmelt recession. This is when snowmelt is dominating what's feeding the river. And instead of this drop happening over the course of days or an hour, it's happening over weeks or maybe even months. And so this part of the hydrograph is critical. And it was so important that the hydrologists at UC Davis actually published a paper about the importance of the snowmelt recession. It was published in the journal Bioscience in 2010. So restoring this part of the hydrograph benefits a lot of species. One of the main ones it benefits is the foothill yellow-legged frog. So it turns out that the foothill yellow-legged frog has evolved and adapted to lay their eggs around this time, and then they're counting on the river, the depth of the river being at just a certain rate so that their eggs will stay wet as they're incubating. And so what happened in 2006, rather than the whitewater flows causing these egg masses to be left high and dry, it's that the frogs had laid their eggs and then the power company shut off the water and left them high and dry. And so restoring that one very small but very critical piece of the hydrograph is helping the frogs. The other thing that happens when they drop the flows like this is that they eliminate the best part of the boating season. And so restoring this has also been very beneficial for whitewater boaters. In a dry year, we're still left without any flows for whitewater recreation. But in a wet year, this is what we get. So the FERC relicensing process is long, and it can be contentious. Trying to reach a settlement agreement is it's challenging. And through this example, we've learned that it's much better to work together towards a common goal. We've learned through the relicensing process and in looking at how rivers are restored that individual river values get parsed out. So we're looking at, the person at the table who wants the frogs to be happy, and then we see the person at the table who wants the fish to be happy, and then we see the other person at the table who wants to go boating. And so we get these individual pieces, but really what we need to be doing is looking to the natural system to see how we can address all of those values within one thing. So what we're doing today is we're working with the frog people, the amphibian biologists, to come together and restore this part of the hydrograph. And the amphibian biologists that we're working with are actually with the Forest Service. And so Dean Amos talked about mandatory conditioning authority. And when we can get the Forest Service on our side, we're much more likely to also have our interests met. So that's another benefit of working together. In California, we're working on over 13 FERC relicensings right now, and we are hoping to restore the snowmelt recession to all of them, or as many as we can. So that's the part of my talk about FERC relicensing and implementation. I am going to talk some about dam removal and about new hydropower, but before I move on there, I'm wondering if anyone has a question or two about relicensing or implementation before I move on. Yeah?
What is the process for getting the hydrologists for UC Davis and the fish biologists to get to work with you? How did you approach that? Was it initiated by you or by them?
I honestly, that was before my time with American Whitewater, so I'm not sure exactly how it went down, but I think I think my colleague went to them and said, hey, what do you see here? Let's try to figure this out. So, anybody else? Yeah.
On the hydrograph, this is a technical question. On the hydrograph where the power company cut off the water, it looks like there's a corresponding event of a great big flow. So did you just happen to know if there was a warm day or a rain event? It's just curious.
How did the hydropower company know to shut it down after that, or?
I was asking if there was an event that was associated that looks like about the same time with the fact that the power company cut the water off. I'm looking at the blue spike there.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly what that is, but my guess is that it's a big spring storm. Yeah. Okay. So FERC relicensing and implementation. There's a lot that's happening there. Sometimes, as we heard, within that process, it is determined that taking the dam out is more economical and provides more of a benefit. And so we've heard a lot about dam removal already, and we're going to continue to hear more about it later today. So I'm not going to talk too much about this here, but I do want to say that there are a lot of different stakeholders that come into play with these proceedings. And in this case in particular, the whitewater recreation community did play a huge role. And so a lot of times when you're thinking about river restoration, you might not be thinking of that element. And I just kind of want to plant the seed in your minds, especially for the law students who are going to be working on this in the future, that you actually have a great ally in that community for these sorts of projects. So here's how things looked just seconds after the TNT was detonated. And this is how it looked just a little over a year later. This is actually a picture of the inaugural float for a lot of members of the whitewater boating community going down through the former dam site. And this is actually where it was Most people who go out there today say they have a hard time even recognizing where the dam used to be. Similar situation on the Elwha River. So we heard about Glines Canyon Dam. Just downstream was the Elwha Dam, was former. This is how it looks today, standing right on the old dam site there. So we're talking about taking dams out, and we're talking about managing dams that are already in. We can talk about putting new dams in. That's actually happening. You might be surprised to learn that. So each of the blue dots on this map of the Pacific Northwest represent an area of hydropower potential. These are not actual proposals, but just potential. Yeah, it's a big deal. I would disagree a little bit with Dean Amos about green, hydropower being green. I think it depends on how you define what green is. Yes, it is definitely produces way less carbon than coal. I think that the water is renewable, but the rivers really aren't. There are a lot of impacts that happen from even the small dams or the micro dams. You might hear about run-of-river. The thing is that those dams still have a very large impact on the system, and so we need to consider that. A lot of what we advocate for is actually retrofitting existing dams to either improve and maximize how much hydropower they're producing, or add hydropower capability to the dams that are already existing. We don't really need to be, in my opinion, we don't need to be damming up new rivers when we have this additional potential that's out there. So part of what we do also in our work with American Whitewater is to respond to the threats of the new dams that are being proposed. The one that makes the least amount of sense to me is proposed for the Bear River Narrows in Idaho. The Bear River already has an extensive amount of hydropower on it. The hydropower system on this river was up for relicensing, and the new license was agreed upon, I believe it was in 2002. Part of that settlement agreement involved $16 million of river restoration projects. Part of that included removing one of the dams that's part of the system. That was called the Cove Dam. It was removed in 2005. The proposal for the new dam in this system is sited 3 miles downstream of the former Cove Dam. And putting a new dam in there would pretty much undo what we just spent a lot of time and effort and money doing. Fortunately, on this project, they were just denied their water right by the state, but that's not really stopping the developer. They're still pushing through. So we have to stay engaged in the process. 2 other sites that we're engaged in right now are on Sunset Falls on the South Fork Skykomish River, and in Ernie's Gorge on the North Fork Snoqualmie, both rivers up in Washington. So when a new dam is proposed, what happens is the hydropower developer will apply for a preliminary permit. This preliminary permit is for 3 years, and it gives them the ability to study whether or not their project is feasible. They are not granted any authority to actually break ground. And then if everything goes according to plan, they apply for a license, and then they're either accepted or denied. There are a lot of environmental laws that come into play where if you're not so keen on having new hydropower go in, you can utilize through that process, including the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. On the local and state level, there are a lot of laws that you can bring in as well. Dean Amos mentioned comprehensive plans. I believe that it's on the North Fork Snoqualmie. There is a comprehensive plan with the county saying that no new hydropower, and so we're bringing that in as well. More often than not, FERC grants the license. but there are some times that they don't. And there's actually precedent with FERC of denying new licenses from going in based on recreation, aesthetic, and public interest purposes. I'm actually working on an article for the journal that will be coming out in April that's going to focus more on the case studies about that. So if it's something that you're interested, please watch for that. So one last slide here. I know I'm probably over time. All of this talk about how much time and energy goes into restoring very small pieces of a hydrograph that, small chunk of how it could be or how it used to be. And then all of this time and energy that goes into preventing new dams from going in, especially the ones that just don't make sense, they don't pencil out economically, it lends itself to an argument for protecting what we already have and preserving the free-flowing rivers that we have out there. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, we primarily do this through the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Right now we're working on 2 campaigns out of many, but 2 in the Pacific Northwest are for Wild Olympics and also for the Wild Rogue. There's already a stretch on the Rogue that's designated as Wild and Scenic, but we're hoping that once Congress figures out how to be functional, again, they will also pass legislation to expand those protections on the Rogue River. So that's all I have.
If you don't mind, if we can do questions together.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. There's no flat spot to the glass.
Hello, I'm Jeanette Burkhardt. I work for the Yakima Nation Fisheries Program as a watershed planner, and I work in the southern ceded lands of the Yakima Nation, so that's off-reservation. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today at the GEL Symposium, and thanks to Dean Amos for setting the stage for some of what I'm going to talk about in terms of the Yakima Nation's involvement with the Condit Dam removal on the White Salmon River. And Mr. Sample can correct any egregious errors I might make later on. I'd like to start out by giving some background and setting the context for Yakima Nation presence in the White Salmon River Basin, and then I'll discuss our involvement as a key stakeholder after that. So to start off with, just in the context of where we're talking about, Inchiwana is the great river in the Yakima language, and based on rich archaeological deposits dating back at least 12,000 years, we know that that the great river supported communities along it for that entire stretch, and that communities flourished based on prodigious salmon runs. Salmon was the centerpiece of diet, culture, spirituality, and trade for thousands of years. The White Salmon River enters the Columbia River from the north, about 167 miles from the Pacific Ocean. It has its headwaters in the glaciers and snowpacks of Mount Adams. And the mountain is known as Pato to the Yakimas, and it's considered a sacred mountain. It provides the water, which is the source of all life, and helps to sustain salmon and other foods that are sacred to the Yakimas. And it helped to sustain native populations that lived around it for millennia. Native peoples interpreted the snowpack to know when to travel to the area to harvest the different foods. The White Salmon River is also home to several species of salmon and steelhead, or Waikanush is the Yakima word for salmon. Yakima people believe that salmon were put on the earth to to feed the native people by the creator. So they're considered a sacred food along with roots and berries and deer. So just to give you an idea of the subbasin, the Columbia River is at the bottom there. The headwaters are up in Mount Adams Wilderness. The river is about 45 miles long, traveling down to the Columbia. It's mostly in steep canyons, so very basaltic, confined channel for most of its length, very few floodplains. One of the important and sort of unique things about the White Salmon River is that it is the subbasin is underlain by a lot of lava tubes that actually hold and release water through springs and through groundwater into the river throughout the year, so that it maintains a very cold temperature year-round, which is actually critical and ideal for salmon. And it's also lightly developed currently. Much of the lower basin is in private ag and forest timberland. Much of the upper basin is in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. It also has 2 federally designated wild and scenic river segments. And Condit Dam was right about there. And in the context of the greater area, just upstream on the Columbia River was an 11-mile reach between the current city of the Dalles and Celilo Falls that was perhaps the biggest, most productive freshwater fishery in tribal North America. And it sustained populations of peoples along its banks, and it provided for a really important trading center right in that area, and specifically at Celilo Falls. So this gives you some idea of the reach of salmon in the mid-Columbia that would sort of be concentrated at Celilo Falls. And you had trade from all the way up in Alaska through Canada, the coastal tribes, folks from the plains would come, and everybody would converge at Celilo Falls to trade, socialize, gamble in some cases. So salmon was sort of the centerpiece of this trade network. This is a little bit zooming in a little bit more closely to the area where the White Salmon River is within the mid-Columbia. The White Salmon River flows through a territory that was long populated by both the Eastern Chinookan-speaking Wishram, White Salmon, and Cascades people, as well as the Sahaptin-speaking, or Ichishkin in the Yakima language, speaking Yakima and Klickitat peoples. So this gives you some idea of just the density of both winter villages, summer villages, and fisheries in the mid-Columbia, and the sort of really diverse mix of peoples that lived in this area. And you'll see the White Salmon River coming in there, and a few of those villages are pointed out there. Indians would winter at some of the villages at the mouth of the river. People led a semi-nomadic lifestyle, moving between the rivers and mountains according to the seasons to harvest resources as they became available, and up and down the Columbia River. And frequently they would move between different groupings to socialize, hunt, gather, trade, and intermarry in some cases. And the White Salmon River formed part of a greater trade network with the Columbia River, these resource areas. There was a trail called the Klickitat Trail that actually went all the way from Fort Vancouver up to the Simcoe, up to the Yakima Valley, and connected a lot of these important trade points. The winter and summer villages along the White Salmon River and its tributaries formed part of this extensive trade network, and all sort of circled back to Celilo Falls as well. Now, Nit is the name of a village that is and was at the mouth of the White Salmon River. It was a winter village and a summer fish camp with salmon drying structures that existed for at least hundreds of years. It was also the first Army Corps, or one of the first Army Corps in lieu sites, which was created to mitigate for losses of main stem tribal fisheries. The chief of the Cascade Indians, Johnny Jackson, still resides there. The property is now owned by the Corps of Engineers and managed as a traditional cultural property by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Underwood in lieu and Namnit site was formally determined eligible for the National Register of Historic Places in 2003, and it remains a significant Native American cultural property for its direct association with Native oral tradition and its continual use as a seasonal fishing site and Native village. This continued to be the case even after a lot of the site was inundated by the Bonneville Pool with the creation of Bonneville Dam in 1937. The White Salmon River provided a focal area for harvesting lower Columbia River fall Chinook, also known as Tule fall Chinook. And my own personal opinion is that that's an Americanization of Mittula, which is actually the name for spawned out or Tule salmon that the native people knew this river as. So it's sort of the namesake. And this was a very important fishery because people would be able to put aside a lot of Tule fall Chinook for a long winter ahead. The early Bureau of Fisheries numbers that I've seen put the runs at between 1,000 and 8,000 fish annually, averaging at about 2,800. The Underwood area near the White Salmon's Mouth was considered a primary Tule fishing area and attracted many families to the region in the fall. In 1843, the Oregon Trail brought the first great wave of settlers past the White Salmon River, and the arrival of Euro-Americans in what 1853 became the Washington Territory led to significant changes for the landscape and its native people. The first homesteader in the area actually occupied a site that was traditionally territory of the White Salmon Band. And just a year later, in 1854, Skamania County was formed on the west side of the White Salmon River, and Native peoples were finding it more difficult to live in their traditional nomadic lifestyle and follow the seasons and their food sources. So with that as a backdrop, we move forward to the Treaty of 1855, in which the U.S. government, represented by Isaac Stevens, the governor of the Washington Territory at the time, entered into a treaty with the Indians of the Pacific Northwest with the intent of clearing the land for Euro-American settlement. 14 different tribes and bands that traditionally had lived north and, I guess you would say, west of the bend in the Columbia River were brought together under this treaty as the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation. And it was more a government construct for political and bureaucratic expediency than a reflection of the reality on the ground for those people. The tribal representatives that were assembled there ceded title to a majority of the nearly 11 million acres of traditional territory, which most Indians didn't even feel was their property per se, in exchange for the reservation of a relatively small parcel of land, the Yakama Reservation at about 1.3 million acres, and the reservation of certain rights that the Indians held to hunt, fish, gather medicinal and food plants in all of their usual and accustomed places, meaning in all of that ceded territory, including the reservation, of course. The treaty was variously interpreted and not ratified until 1859, in the interim of which there were a variety of hostilities and conflicts among Indians, between Indians and white settlers, between Indians and the U.S. government. But the treaty is still the supreme law of the land and ensures tribal members' rights to fish in water bodies off the reservation. So one of the most important provisions to tribal members is this one right here, the right of taking of fish at all usual and accustomed stations. In the United States versus Winans in 1905, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the off-reservation fishing rights possessed by the Yakama tribe as, quote, not much less necessary to the existence of the Indians than the atmosphere they breathed. This right was affirmed in the landmark tribal fishing rights case, So Happy versus Smith, or U.S. v. Oregon, and also known as the Belloni decision in 1969 and U.S. v. Washington, or the Bolt decision in 1974. In addition, it was interpreted as meaning that Indians had a right to half of the allowable catch of fish returning to their traditional fisheries, and it established the tribes as co-managers of the fisheries in the ceded lands. The Yakama Nation also has an unquantified treaty water right sufficient to support anadromous, resident, and other aquatic life, which applies to natural flow and storage of water. So predating even the states of Oregon and Washington, the Treaty of 1855 and the usual and accustomed provision has been affirmed as the supreme law of the land, which states and their officials are bound to observe. The U.S. v. Winans case established the reserved rights doctrine and the sovereignty of the tribes as well. So I won't tick through all those, but essentially there were a lot of land use changes that happened in the interim. Euro-American settlement in the mid-Columbia brought a number of fundamental changes to the habitats and traditional resources and resource sites that are at the basis of the Indians' treaty reserved rights. The county of Klickitat was formed right about when the treaty was ratified on top of those ceded lands of the Yakama Nation. As regional development increased, there was a resulting loss of access for the tribes to their usual and accustomed places. Eventually, traditionally hunted and gathered wildlife, hazelnuts, berries, and so on, gave way to Euro-American dominated ranches, apple orchards, and cities, and resource sites were converted or access blocked as industrialization and electrification progressed throughout the West. And that takes us to the Condit Project. So Condit Project was part of this electrification of the West. It was originally built to power a paper mill in Camas, Washington, and eventually came to power about 5,000 homes. It was built in 1912 and employed hundreds of people in the construction, completed in 1913. And it's significant, I think, because when you look back at a lot of the old photos, it was constructed using local materials, local timber, local rock, and using hand and horsepower, essentially. Condit Dam lacked fish passage since the early 1900s. There were 2 attempts made to provide a fish ladder over the dam, which is 125 feet tall. And both times, in 1914 and 1918, those fish ladders were blown out in winter floods. There was even an attempt to put in a fish elevator, which was very high-tech at the time, but that also failed. Northwestern Electric Company, who owned the dam, mitigated with the loss of that fish passage through a cash settlement to the Department of Fisheries to build a hatchery on the Columbia River. Indians were not consulted on the construction of the dam and were not compensated for their losses. Condit Dam was a physical and ideological barrier to both the river and traditional land use patterns that had centered around it for centuries. Its construction drastically changed the area for Indians who were no longer able to harvest salmon and live in the traditional way. Impacts from a variety of land use changes have had well-documented effects on anadromous fish populations. Hydropower development was responsible for the detriment or loss of many main stem Columbia River tribal fisheries and fishing sites. And on the White Salmon River, it interrupted treaty rights. Along with other factors, it disrupted an entire way of life. So the original federal operating license from 1968 was set to expire in 1993. So Pacific Power, PacifiCorp's predecessor, initiated the relicensing process to look at some of the potential safety issues surrounding this aging infrastructure and ongoing O&M issues, such as a reservoir that was rapidly filling with sediment. It was about half full already at this time. Also, this harkens back to one of the photos that Megan showed, flows in the bypass reach, so the reach between where the water was diverted and to where it actually produced power between the dam and the powerhouse. Those flows were low enough to have severe impacts on water quality. And there were also, due to peaking and sudden releases at the project, there was mortality of juvenile salmon in the lower river through stranding in the shallow margins of the river and so on. So in 1990, we had the first ESA listings of salmon and steelhead. And now the river is, has listed Chinook, coho, chum, and steelhead. Those are the species in the White Salmon River that are all listed under the ESA. So there was a scoping EIS entered into for the application to relicense, which included an economic feasibility study to provide fish passage using 3 different alternatives. And they were a fish ladder, which would provide upstream passage for adult fish. But there were lots of engineering constraints because it's a tall dam at 125 feet tall. And this was at about $34 million was the estimate. Then there was the option for trapping and hauling, which essentially meant intercepting adults downstream and hauling them around the dam site so they could spawn in the upper river. This did not help with downstream passage for juveniles, however, although screening was required at the turbines. And then the other option that was looked at was dam removal. And the original estimate of $54 million for dam removal included dredging and sediment removal, of which there was a lot, as I mentioned, accumulated behind the dam. So the Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS wanted a fish ladder because they thought it was more attainable. Pacific Corp was interested initially in the trap and haul option. But American Rivers, the Friends of the White Salmon River, and Yakima Nation still held out for dam removal. And the Yakima Nation maintained that a fish ladder would only address upstream passage, but would not provide a solution for outmigrating juveniles. Bob Heineth with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, which was one of the interveners, had been involved with the Elwha Dam process and thought that the dam removal estimates of $54 million were perhaps inflated. And he commissioned a $20,000 study with Pacific Corp and the Yakima Nation. And this engineering study came up with a different estimate for dam removal using a different technique, being the blow and go, which we saw a lovely video of earlier. And it also modeled sediment movement and so on. And that was $10 million instead of $54 million for dam removal. Ted Strong, who was then the director of CRITFIC, was on a commission with Terry Flores of Pacific Power, the predecessor of Pacific Corp. And it gave them an opportunity to get to know one another and talk in depth about the possibility of the dam removal. And the idea that the hydropower project had sort of had its time, it had run its course, and maybe it was time to look at a way to decommission it. Pacific Corp then approached the Yakima Nation leadership and with an idea. And in 93, 94, Yakima Nation and CRITFIC, along with Pacific Corp, reached an agreement in principle with a cost cap. A few other agencies were displeased because they hadn't been part of the negotiations, and relationships deteriorated a bit between some of the interveners, but the Yakima Nation never felt obligated to go with the crowd that preferred the trap and haul option. So as time went on, an agreement in principle was formalized, and in 96, FERC actually required the installation of fish ladders and screens to comply with ESA requirements. And this would have cost about $30 million. FERC also wanted to address that in-stream flow issue in the bypass reach and that would have meant leaving more water in the river and reducing the project's hydroelectric generation capacity. This made the dam less economical to operate. In January of '97, Pacific Power, requested that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission halt the relicensing proceedings to allow for continued discussions with the interveners, including the Yakima Nation, CRITFIC, and others, to reach a settlement agreement. Most of the discussions focused on methods and costs of removing the dam and addressing those short-term impacts that would be associated with its removal. Settlement agreement was reached, and other parties were asked to sign on to the agreement. Sorry. Pages are sticking together. A press conference was held, and the agreement was announced, but no one from the tribes was asked to come up and speak at the platform. Plenty of other parties took credit for the agreement. Bob Hyneth had doggedly pursued this dam removal throughout, even though other parties had expressed concerns, such as the Forest Service had been concerned about impacts to some of the outstandingly remarkable values which they're supposed to protect for the wild and scenic river, such as the trout fishery. Pacificor made the business decision to remove the dam. So Pacificor operated the project in the meantime on annual licenses while permitting and other issues were resolved. And the water quality permitting, as we heard earlier, through ecology, Army Corps of Engineers, and so on, and other permitting was protracted and complicated by the fact that there would be an undeniable and potentially large exceedance of water quality criteria if the dam was breached using this blow and go method. But eventually the idea of short-term impact for long-term gain won out. There was also opposition from counties on both sides of the river. They opposed the removal and mounted legal challenges to try and slow down or avert the dam removal using anything they could think of, such as heavy metals in the reservoir sediments, western pond turtles. The Klickitat Public Utility District even considered condemning the project and taking it over to keep it from being decommissioned, but then realized that that was not economical. And as it turns out, the results of the reservoir samples came out pretty clean. They were about the same level of mercury, which is naturally occurring in some of these basaltic systems, but it was about the same level as in the main stem Columbia. So that ended up not being an issue. In the interim, the Yakima Nation was involved in a variety of different collaborative efforts, such as subbasin and watershed planning, until that latter process was torpedoed in the White Salmon Basin. Salmon recovery planning, which involved helping the National Marine Fisheries Service write a recovery plan for the White Salmon Basin, and eventually fish accords with federal action agencies. So eventually Pacificor reached a settlement agreement with the counties, and that helped to secure the replacement and repositioning of the City of White Salmon's water line, reinforcement of some infrastructure, and the dam's non-consumptive water right. I know that issue came up earlier, and various other provisions. The Yakima Nation secured a mitigation fund for dealing with the in lieu sites being embedded in sediment, and a fisheries enhancement fund, which is dependent on cost overruns to the project. So the White Salmon Technical Working Group was formed in 2007. Yakima Nation was part of that with a number of the different stakeholders, including Pacificor, that were looking at how to deal with the impacts of the breach on listed fish species that would be in the lower river at the time of the breach, and how to salvage those fish and so on. And then also to come up with some, options for recolonization versus reintroduction, what was going to happen to those fish species that had been absent from the basin for 100 years, and would they need assistance in being able to recolonize the basin. Then the Yakima Nation assisted with the implementation of that salvage plan. The preferred option that was decided on was sort of a 5-year wait-and-see approach to see what kind of natural recolonization would happen in the basin on its own, and then kind of reassess what, if anything, would need to be done to assist some of those stocks of fish. So part of the Yakima Nation's settlement agreement with PacifiCorp includes a fisheries enhancement fund, and the tribe, as I mentioned, is taking a step back. There is currently no tribal fishery in the in the White Salmon Basin as fish runs rebuild on their own. And then depending on how well the recolonization works, there's the opportunity later on to look at options for supplementation or habitat actions to benefit the fish. So far, things are looking promising with recolonization, so the Fisheries Enhancement Fund may be used just for habitat projects. Then we flash forward to December of 2010 and the surrender order from FERC, and it looked like Condit Dam would finally seem real and inexorable to be removed. There were a lot of preparations that had to go on to prepare for the decommissioning. There were a slew of different management plans that PacifiCorp had to submit to FERC for approval, and it was still the largest dam removal ever attempted in the United States until today. Sad to lose that. Lots to do on the decommissioning itself. There was obviously a lot of sediment that had built up that had to be dealt with, 2.4 million cubic yards, they think. There were 30,000 cubic yards of concrete that would have to be removed and put somewhere. Listed fish in the lower river to salvage, archaeological and cultural resources, and infrastructure to replace and protect. So a lot happened in the time leading up to the breach day, which was a very emotional day for tribal members and many other folks on both sides of the issue. Some people that had worked very hard to see the dam removal through didn't actually survive to see it, such as Tim Weaver, the counsel for the Yakima Nation. Some had lived their entire lives with the river in chains and fish unable to get to their homes. Because of the central role of salmon in tribal culture, economy, diet, the century that the dam stood and blocked passage helped to speed emigration of tribal families from the basin. So Breach Day also represented a great hope that the white salmon could return to something close to what it had been and sustain some tribal members and their families in the basin. There were elders that wept at the decommissioning, at the breach. There were some younger Yakimas that have strong roots in the basin that were very excited to have their kids potentially be able to grow up fishing for salmon as their great-grandparents and their ancestors had done. There's still deep tribal roots in the area. And there were some surprises with the dam breach, as we mentioned, that it had been estimated that it would take about 6 hours to drain the reservoir, and it was under 2. So even though there was some time-lapse photography in there, it really felt time-lapse when you watched the reservoir drain out. It was really quite remarkable. So then came the year-long process of decommissioning, and that involved the removal of the dam, associated structures, intake, cofferdams, and all of these things progressed really pretty smoothly. I would say PacifiCorp had some great contractors that were working on it, and everything went very safely as well. Then a cleanup, reclamation of the construction areas, and so on. And the last phase has been a there was a lot of sediment stabilization that needed to be done in the reservoir, hydroseeding and planting of, I think, close to 14,000 trees in the 92-acre reservoir area. So all of those things helped to stabilize the sediments and start the reservoir on a self-generating path towards becoming a riparian forest again, with all the benefits to fish and wildlife that that has. So there were a number of expected and unexpected impacts from the dam removal. Obviously, the reservoir draining out. There were tributaries to the reservoir that downcut way more than was expected. A lot of instability around places that weren't necessarily expected to be unstable. Some dust mitigation that had to happen because of unvegetated reservoir sediments for a while. And things emerged from the river that nobody realized were still there, like bridge footings. So Pacificor had to deal with a lot of different things that they both expected and things that popped up that I think were probably fairly complicated and expensive in the long run. So everybody wants to know, did it work? Did the fish come back? And the cofferdam was removed. The cofferdam was sort of the last impediment in the river that had been built initially to bypass water around the project site. And that was removed the end of May 2012. By July 2012, we saw steelhead returning to the dam, above the dam site, so quite a ways upriver. This is even above the next barrier falls of Hewson Falls. This is at BZ Falls. So we knew at least by July of 2012 that steelhead were coming back into the river. And they were actually swimming through the 90-foot drain tunnel in the dam at that point. So the dam wasn't even removed. And just to give you some idea of where spawning happened last fall and some little bit this spring as well, all of those colored marks on the map show where spawning occurred last fall. So we had upriver bright fall Chinook, which are not technically native to the basin, lower Columbia River fall Chinook. There was one spring Chinook red that was seen, and we had steelhead probably using two of the major tributaries up above the old Condit Reach and spawning there this spring. And one thing I want to point out is that some of these areas, like below where the former dam site had been accessible to fish for spawning before that. But because the river had been starved of sediments for a century, there really hadn't been very much spawning gravel in that lower section. So the decommissioning and the removal of the dam that had been holding all that gravel back meant that it got to redistribute throughout the lower river. So there were a lot of new spawning areas that hadn't been there before. And then this year, we've also seen the return of spring Chinook, which was very doubtful because they had been considered extirpated to the system. And we actually had several dozen spring Chinook spawning in the river. And all of that was above the former dam site. We have fall Chinook coming in now, beginning to spawn. So the Underwood in Lucite obviously had some severe impacts from the decommissioning. It had been continually used by tribal fishers until the breach of the Condit Dam. Since then, the river access out into the Columbia has not been available because of sediment. And the Yakima leadership is currently evaluating several options for trying to deal with that navigation issue and for stabilizing the area, because with 29,000 cubic yards of sediment coming annually from Mount Adams, it's going to continue to be a challenge to keep that in Lucite open and access to fishers available. So there's some different options being looked at there. And the Yakima Nation is developing some cost share with the mitigation funds from Pacificor. Just to give a quick recap, the current uses of the river are for irrigation. There are quite a number of orchards in the valley. The White Salmon City water supply comes out of one of the tributaries. We have commercial and private boating as a huge industry for the local economy. There are 10 different permitted outfitters, and there's an estimate of about 30,000 people a year that come to the White Salmon River to raft. There's also a sport fishing industry there, and now there are new places for sport fishers to actually fish. So the dam decommissioning provides a lot of opportunities and challenges for any of the managers or stakeholders in the area. Regaining the tribal fishery and culture on the white salmon is obviously paramount to the Yakama Nation. There are a lot of opportunities for conservation and restoration in the river. It has fairly decent habitat, but some of it has been pretty heavily impacted by past and present land use. Enhancing the fishery, there's now restored access to 33 miles of habitat for steelhead, cumulatively about 14 for salmon. Pacific lamprey are also a very important cultural fish for the Yakama Nation, and we think they may be able to access even more than these other fish. There's also the necessary fine sediment for their juvenile development, so it may be a great basin for Pacific lamprey, and they need help. And then there's the opportunity to collaborate with a lot of the stakeholders in the basin. We do have a number of different challenges. There's definitely a lot of pressure to increase development along the river, and residential development in these rural areas means exempt wells, and there is definitely connection between groundwater and surface water. So groundwater that is extracted without monitoring can have unknown impacts on our surface water. So that's definitely something that the Yakama Nation is very concerned about. There's also varying protection and interpretation of our shorelines regulations and critical areas. So that's been an ongoing issue that we're working hard on. Just generally, there's a lot of demands on the resources of the river. We have a continuing sort of downward trajectory of salmon and lamprey, and we have a lot of folks using the river at once, whether it's extracting water or using it for recreation. And that's a wonderful thing that we have new recreational opportunities, but it's going to be a real challenge to balance all of these competing demands. And as Megan alluded to, there's definitely still hydropower development on the table. It has not been removed just because of the removal of a single dam. There are some irrigators up in the upper valley that are looking at micro hydropower development through their irrigation system. So these are all things that we're sort of having to juggle and trying to work with the various stakeholders to kind of navigate a way forward in the basin. And the Yakama Nation is definitely very excited about the way that the river is having an opportunity to return to its more natural state. And a century seems like a long time for the river to have been altered pretty severely, but it really, to a lot of tribal members, it feels like the blink of an eye in the larger scheme of things. And taking a long view and insisting that the river should return to its natural state has definitely paid off. Now it's time for the human stakeholders in the basin, the agencies, the tribes, the residents even, to write the next chapter together. Thank you.